We're now on Daf Tzadi Gimel Amid Beis, and we're trying to understand what's the problem with deriving the psul of smicha of a suma from Einei Ha'eda. And the answer is done in Yachid Miyachiv, ain't done in Yachid Mitzibu. We're talking about a suma who brings his own personal carbon as a chovas yachid. You cannot derive any conclusions about a suma from the parsha of Parhelim Dovashal Tzibur, because that's a tzibur carbon, not a carbon yachid. Ulaman to Yolch Mizikne Eid, according to the other opinion, that we derive the psul of Suma in Smicha from Ziknei Ha'eda, my time alo Yolf Melos Riyah. Why couldn't he allow himself to derive it from Oles Riyah, where the Torah says that there's no Smicha in the case of a blind person? Tanin midi d'chsiv bei Smicha begufei, mimidi d'chsiv bei Smicha begufei, lafuki Oles Riyah dehi gufa me Oles Nedava Gemira. Meaning, the Torah gave us the mitzvah of smicha in Parhelim Dovashal Tzibur. That's called migufe. And therefore, in any carbon which the suma brings, that smicha is migufe. So it makes sense to derive the status of a suma in his own personal carbon vis-a-vis smicha from the case of a Parhelim Dovashal Tzibur. Why? Because there too, the smicha of a Parhelim Dovashal Tzibur is canonized, is written in the parsha of Parhelim Dovashal Tzibur. That's where smicha is. But in the case of Olas Re'iyah, we don't know from the Torah explicitly in the context of Olas Re'iyah that Torah requires smicha. We only know it because we compare the Olas Re'iyah to an Olas Nedava. And since the Torah says explicitly that an Olas Nedava needs smicha, therefore a Olas Re'iyah needs smicha. But it's not migufe. There's no mention of smicha in the parsha of Olas Re'iyah. So now the Gemara wants to prove that very last point that we made, the Tani Tana Kamed Rav Yitzchak bar Abba, Vayakrev. Okay, we're now going back to the parsha of Miluim, and it says here, Vayakrev, Aaron brought Es Ha'olah Vayaser Kimishpat. Now the question is whether Aaron's Karban Olah at the time of the Chanukas HaMishkan required smicha. And the Torah added the word kamishpat in the context of Aaron's Olah at the time of the dedication of the Mikdash. So what does that word bamishpat come to teach me? Kimishpat olas nedava. That even though Aaron was commanded to bring that Olah, and therefore becomes an Olas Chova, and the original smicha at the beginning of Sefer Vayikra is in the context of an Olas Nedava, Kamishpat is an extra word teaching you, limed al Olas Chova shetu'una smicha ke Olas Nedava. And therefore, in the case of Olas Re'iyah, we know that the Olas Re'iyah is going to require smicha from the fact that we equate an Olas Chova to an Olas Nidav. Your paradigmic case of smicha is the Olas Nidav. Mishnah continues, Ha'evid v'ashliach v'yishatan rabbanon, yado v'lo yad avdo. We're going to derive from the word yado, and let's see if we could read the pasuk. All right, it's at the beginning of Vayikra Perek Gimel, And three times the Torah repeats the word yado with regard to smicha in a shlomim, korban shlomim. So the first yado comes to exclude the lo yad avdo. Now, even though the Eved has a partial status of a Jew, and not only that, Yad Avdo ki Yad Rabo, his Yad, the Eved's Yad should be like the extension of the Yad of his master. Nevertheless, Yado comes to exclude Yad Avdo. Yado, the second Yado, Velo Yad Shlucho, that normally a shliach is like the extended arm of the mishalech, but the exclusion is going to be in the case, the exception is going to be in the case of smicha. And finally, yad v'lo yad ishto. And the Gemara is going to try to explain why we would have thought that although a shliach could not represent the mishalech, the owner of the korban for smicha, we still might think that maybe, if not for the third yado, an isha could perform smicha on behalf of her husband. Kol hani lamali. Why do we need all three? Tzricha. Because of Rachman, if the Torah had said chad havamina, if only one yada would have appeared, I would have said lemute eved. Why? Because an eved doesn't have kedushas Yisrael shlema ukmura. He has certain mitzvos, but he doesn't have other mitzvos. And to labar mitzvahs, since he doesn't have those other mitzvos, that's why he's excluded from smicha, because smicha is bnei Yisrael, etc. Aval shliach is chayiv mitzvah. He has the same identical kedusha Yisrael as the bailam of the korban is dvar mitzvah, and therefore shlucha shalom kemoso. Rashi quotes a Gemara in Kiddushin that derives from korban Pesach, because in korban Pesach it says v'shachat, even though the entire community could be yotze with one korban Pesach, and the answer is because shlucha shalom kemoso. That shochet represents all the members of Klal Yisrael. Is therefore ema lismoch. Since we have a principle of shlucho shalom kemoso, we would think the shliach can certainly function and validate the smicha on behalf of the mishalech. So if I need the second viyodo, so I have one viyodo to exclude an eved, another viyodo to exclude shliach, the iashmin and hanitarte, I would still think that an isha could do a smicha on behalf of a husband. The lav gufei dami, because the shliach is not the goof of the mishalech of the bailim of Ruvain, nor is he, right, the eved, the goof of the adon. Aval isha de kigufei dami. We have many halachas in which we say ishto kigufa, that a woman is like the goof of a husband, a married woman, right? For example, all right, right away I'm thinking of the Taz as far as Hadlakas near Chanukah, but let's leave out the Taz. That's way beyond our pay scale. Anyway, let's say, for example, in Hafaras Nedarim, right, the husband and the wife are considered like one goof, and the husband could show up in front of a tribunal in order to effectuate Hafaras Nedarim on behalf of his wife. Not sure the other way around. I don't think a married woman effectuate a hafaras nedarim on behalf of her husband. I don't know. That has to be taken under advisement. Tzricha, and therefore I need a pasuk yado to exclude isha. Smicha shiari mitzvah. We say that smicha is an addition to the mitzvah, but it's not critical. He can achieve the kaparas hakarban even in the absence of smicha. Tanarabban of his samach v'nirtza. Wait a minute. In the parsha of smicha, it says nirtza. Nirtza is referring to the ritzui karban. V'chi smicha v'chaperes. How do you understand that pasuk? Hello, ein kapara b'dam. It's the zrikas adam that effectuates the kapara. So why does it say v'samach v'nirtza? Elolomer lecha shemasol l'smicha shiari mitzvah ma'ilov hakosaki lo kiper v'kiper. Although it's true that he will achieve kapara with the zrikas adam even in the absence of smicha, but it's not a complete kapara. He's treating it as shiari mitzvah, but it's really like an integral part of the kapara, and it completes the kapara. So without the smicha, ep is felt. Something's missing. Tanya Gabi Tnufa Ki Gavna. We have a similar idea with regard to Tnufa. And now we're quoting a pasuk in Vayikra Perik Yud Dalet with regard to Tnufa, which has to take place in the Azara. L'Tnufa L'Chaper. Seemingly, from the simple reading of the pasuk, it seems that tenufa is absolutely essential to the kapara. V'chi tenufa chaper solein kapara l'bedam shenever ki adamu hanefesh v'nefesh yichaper eloloma shemasol l'tenufa shor mitzvah ma'alav akosu ki lo kiper v'kiper. He has a kapara without tenufa, but not the complete kapara. Al harosh smicha is performed on the head of the animal. Ton rabbanon yodo al harosh. Right, he has to put his hand on the head of the animal. But lo yodo al tzavor, but not on the neck of the animal. Yodo al rosh velo yodo al gabayim, but not on the back of the animal. Yodo al rosh velo yodo al choz, but not on the chest of the animal. Frek the Gemara, kol hani lamali. Why do I need three extra psukim? Tzrich. If you only had one pasuk l'mutei tzara, I would say let's exclude the neck. Velo koi bahadi arosh, because it's not part of the head. Aval gabo, but let's say the back of his head, the koila hadi rosho, right? It's part of the head. Emolo, maybe that's not possible. If I only had two to exclude the neck and the back, Mishum the lowest Rabbi Litnufa. Avol Chazed dis Rabbi Litnufa Emalo. So with regard to the mitzvah of Tnufa, you could do the Tnufa with the Chaza. And therefore I might think that in the case of Smicha, you could do Smicha by putting your hands onto the Chaza, and therefore I need a third. Ibailu, Yodo alatstadim mahu. Can you validate a Smicha when he leans his hands on the sides of the animal's head? There's the top of the head, and then there's the sides of the head. Like, for example, in the Isser of Pa'as Rosh Chalot Baltakiv, you've got the hair on the top of the head, and then you have the jaws. That's also included in the Isser Baltakiv. When I say the jaw, there are two parts of the jaw. There's this part, if you put your hands here, you'll feel a bone. And then there's this part of the jaw. So what's the story if he does smicha on the sides of the animal's head? Toshma, we learned in a brisa, Abba bira b'Rabbi Yaakov Omer, Yodo al rosho, velo yodo al stadim. Okay, so that's the end of that. Boy, Rabbi Yirmiyah, matlis mahu. What about a chatzitza between his hands and the head of the animal, like a matlis, right? A shmata. Ma'u shetochutz. Is there a din of chatzitza? Toshma b'vad shlotei dover chotzeitz beino levein hazev. No chatzitza. It's got to be yodo al rosh on the head of the animal. B'shtei yodayim. You know what I mean? How do we know that you need smicha with two? Right? It says the solach is yodo. Maybe one hand is enough. Then you'd have to know whether it's the right hand or left hand. Maybe it depends whether you're righty or left. So now we have a problem, because on the one hand, the Torah says v'samach yodo. On the other hand, in the case of Aaron, it says v'samach Aaron shtei yodo. It's ksiv yodo, ksiv shtei. Sebona av kol mokum shenemer yodo harei kan shtayim at sheyifrat l'cha kosiv achas. So from the fact that it says shtei yodo, we understand that yodo means shtei yodayim. And the only time yodo means one hand is if the Torah says explicitly yodo achas. Now, do we have an example of yodo achas? I don't know. ukshartem lios. Maybe ukshartem lios al yodecha, that you only have to put the tefillin on one arm and not on both arms, because it says yodecha in the singular. Also, Rabbi Elazar, Omer lo shmai be midrasha, v'lo omer shmei Reish Lakish, shomer Reish Lakish ve'ikpa. Reish Lakish got very angry at the fact that his name wasn't mentioned. Osivle, he says to Rabbi Elazar, let me just see what time it is, because I lose. Not bad. Isal kedaita kol hechadich siv yodo. Tarte ninu, the way you said it, unless the Torah says yodo achas, yodo means both hands, is lama lila michtav yodov. Yodov. Now, which psukim have yodov, yodov? We'll see. In any event, the word yodov is in the plural. Is actually esrim v'arba yodov. Reish Lakish wanted to make Rabbi Elazar feel like a little bit dumb, so he quotes 24 times where the Torah uses the word yodov. Now, there's a whole literature on this. How do you calculate 24 times yodov? I wanted to do a word search on in the computer, but I didn't get a chance. Anyway, the Arayosha says that if you look at the entire Tanakh, you'll find the word yodov 40 times mentioned in Tanakh. So he has to figure out why the Gemara says 24. In any event, we have a couple of examples here. Yodov tivienu. Okay, that's Korban Shlomim. And it says Yodov Rav Lo. Right, this is the bracha that Moshe Rabbeinu bestows at the end of the Torah on Shevet Yehuda. And Sikelos Yodov is Yaakov Avinu in Parshas Vayechi when he switches his hands from one to the other. So why does it say Yodov in plural, according to you, Rabbi Elazar, and you're quoting a halacha, which Reish Lakish knew was his halacha? When it says Yodo, it means Yodov, until it says Yodo Achas. Ishte. Rabbi Elazar realized he didn't have an answer. Lebasa denach daite, Amalei, my timer lo tamali. Why didn't you give me the following answer? So Reish Lakish says that after he calms down a little bit. Yadav desmicha ka'amri. Reish Lakish says that the source of the Binyan Av is the verse that speaks about smicha with regard to the Soil Azazah. There, the Torah writes Yadav. I'm sorry, Yadav, but it's really Yado in the Ksiv without a Yud. So therefore, whenever it says Yado with regard to smicha, you require two hands. But we don't derive from smicha that Yado means two hands every time it appears in Scripture. And therefore, the Torah 24 times over says Yadav with a Yud. B'smicha nami ksiv, but wait a second, Rabbi Elazar says, I'll tell you, I'll defend self-defense why I didn't give you that answer, because even in smicha it says, Vayismoch es Yadav alav vayitzavehu. So we see clearly that Yadav is written even with a Yud, Yadav, right, in full, even with regard to smicha. And Reish Lakish answers, smicha de behema ka'amri. I was talking about smicha of an animal in the context of a carbon, and you're talking about a smicha in a different context where Moshe Rabbeinu bestows, if I could use that word, bestows smicha on Yoshua. With this we'll conclude for today. Takef l'smicha shchita. My ka'amar hachi ka'amar b'makom shesomchim shochtim shetakef l'smicha shchita. Right? Since we want to combine the smicha with the shchita, therefore the shchita is performed in the same place where he did the smicha, and immediately after he did the smicha. And we end today's daf with the Mishnah, which compares smicha to tnufa. Chomer b'smicha mi b'tnufa. We're more machmir in smicha than we are in tnufa, but at the same token, we're more machmir b'tnufa mi b'smicha. Why? She'echad meinif l'chol haverim, right? If you have a carbon of shutfim, then it's enough that one of the bailim, one of the shutfim, will implement tnufa. But in the case, this is Shittas Chacham against Rabbi Yehuda that we learned earlier, that in the case of smicha with shutfim, every single one of the shutfim has to implement his own personal ma'aser smicha. Chomer, on the other hand, betnufa, shatnufa noheges b'karbonos hayachid u'b'karbonos hatzibur. Tnufa is required for both a carbon yachid and a carbon tzibur. For example, a private shlomim, as well as the kivsei atzeres, which is tzibur, on Chag HaShavuos, b'chayim u'b'shchutim, live animals, and after shchita. Okay, this is a reference to the shalmei, the kivsei atzeres, which is a shlomim of a carbon tzibur on Shavuos. And there we do tnufa twice. That's as we learned in the Mishnah above on Samach Aleph. Once with the live kvasim, together with the shtei alechem, and again with the chaz of shok after shchita. U'b'davar sheyesh lo bo ruach chayim, u'davar she'ein bo ruach chayim, right? Because we do tnufa even after shchita. Masha'en came b'smicha, smicha only applies to a carbon yachid, not to a carbon tzibur. Only applies to an animal and not to something that's not living. Oh, in other words, there's no smicha on lechem, like for example, lechem aponim, or lachmei todo and lachmei nazir, whereas there is tnufa. And that's the end of this Mishnah. We're almost at the end of the parak, but Amir Hashem will finish the parak tomorrow and start the next parak. Is the next parak the last parak? 1 second. No. The 3 more parak. Okay, Rabbi, so tomorrow we meet at 12 noon. Is that correct? All right, have a great day.